there's no way you're going to be psychologically thriving. And that's more pragmatic in some sense than psychological, right? Human beings have a nature. There's things we need. And if we have them, well, that's good. And if we don't have them, well, then we feel the lack. And so behaviorists, behavioral psychologists concentrate a lot more on that sort of thing. You know, it's practical. It's like strategizing. Make a career plan. Figure out how to negotiate, because that's bloody important. Figure out how to say what you need. Figure out how to tell the truth to people. Figure out how to listen to your partner in particular, because if you listen to them, they will actually tell you what they want. And sometimes you can give it to them, and maybe they'll return the favor. And if you practice that for like 15 years, well, then maybe you're constantly giving each other what you want. Well, hooray, that would be good. And then there's two of you under both circumstances, and it's better to have two brains than one, because people think differently because of their temperament mostly. And so the negotiation is where the wisdom arises, and it's part of the transformation, the psychological transformation that's attendant on an intimate relationship, and one of the fundamental purposes of a long-term intimate relationship. You know, we've been fed this unending diet of rights and freedoms, and there's something about that, especially, there's something about that that's so pathologically wrong, and people are starving for the antidote, and the antidote is truth and responsibility, right? And it isn't because that's what you should do in some, you know, in some I know better or someone knows better for you what you should do sense. It's that that's the secret to a meaningful life, and without a meaningful life, then all you have is suffering and nihilism and despair and all of that, and self-contempt, and that's not good. And so it's necessary for men to stand up and take responsibility, and they all know that, and are starving for that message. And the message is more that that's also a good thing, to stand up and take responsibility, because you're cursed so much now from when you're young with this notion that your active engagement with the world is part of what is destroying and undermining the planet and adding to the tyranny of the social systems. It's like, how about not so much of that, hey? Because it's too soul deadening. It's anti-human right to the core. And my sense instead is that, you know, if you were able to reveal the best of yourself to you in the world, that you would be an overwhelming force for good, and that whatever errors might be made along the way would wash out in the works. And that's the other thing that you see in the Abrahamic stories, because Abraham is not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. He's a real person, and he makes mistakes, but it doesn't matter. The overarching narrative is, you know, maintain your covenant with God, and despite your inadequacies, then not only will you prevail, but your descendants will prevail. It's like, great, that's really good news, you know. So it's been really something to see that in the story. Genuine ethical virtue is it's the only source of resilience and strength that you have. And it's also the place, as far as I can tell, that the meaning that allows you to set yourself against suffering resides. You know, people talk about life and its meaning, and they say, well, life is meaningless, but people never mean that, because if you're in pain or you're terrified, you're overwhelmed with meaning. It's just not the kind of meaning you want. And it's not a reality you can talk yourself out of easily. And that's particularly true of pain, but it can also be true of anxiety. And so the question is there a reliable source of meaning that you can set against that? And what's its nature, if so? And so here's a way of conceptualizing it to some degree. So I'm currently in a rather remote location in Northern Ontario. And one of the advantages to being here is that I can go out on my dock at night and I can look up and see the night sky. And when you see the night sky, when it's pitch black, you are face to face with something as near to the infinite as we can face in a prosaic day-to-day setting. And so there's an experience that goes along with that, and the experience is one of awe and wonder. And awe is a very interesting emotion. Let's say it's unbelievably ancient from a biological perspective. So if you feel awe, your hair might stand up on end. And sometimes you get that feeling, chills running down your back, say, when you're listening to music that you particularly enjoy. And that's a variant of the reflex that prey animals have when they see a predator. Their hair stands on end so that they look bigger. Now, of course, they don't know that. So part of that feeling of awe is tied to our ancient mammalian heritage. It's a variation of the response we had to a predator. We're facing something much greater than ourselves. And so, but there's more to it if you think it through, because when you face the night sky, for example, or you confront something that fills you with wonder and awe, there's also a call to action that's sort of implicit in it. Maybe you think, well, the wolf is calling to the rabbit to be better at defending itself in some sense, to be a better rabbit, because otherwise, man, you're going to be eaten by the wolf. And when you look up in the night sky, to the night sky, and you feel awe, there's a call there. It's part of that experience to imitate that great thing that you perceive. Now, you might say, well, how can you imitate the infinite cosmos as well? Obviously, that's a very complicated question. But, you know, you're a very complicated thing. And God only knows what it means for you to imitate the infinite when you apprehend it. I mean, in some sense, that's the fundamental question of life. It's how do we adapt ourselves to the infinite complexity that surrounds us? What must we become? Well, you don't merely think that through. And I mean, you don't, I don't, human beings in general don't. We puzzle it out, and we use all sorts of information to do that. And some of these more primordial experiences that are outside the domain of strict rationality nonetheless point us in an ethical direction. And the ethic would be, you should and could be more than you are. Well, then the question is, how do you bring that to earth? How does that look when you try to embody it day to day? Well, I would say these are obviously not my ideas. They're very old ideas. Well, maybe you ally yourself with truth to the degree that you can. Maybe you pursue beauty. Maybe you pursue the love that attaches you appropriately to other people, etc., etc. And so, and you do that because, well, I think you do it because life is very, very difficult. Gray developed a theory of emotion that's predicated on the idea that, essentially on the idea that most of your emotions are experienced in relationship to a goal.
Okay.
And so you establish a goal, then movement towards that goal, or evidence that you could move towards that goal, makes you happy, produces positive emotion, whereas evidence that the goal is invalid or that you're blocked in some way produces negative emotion. So you lay this map on the world. It always has a destination point in mind. There's always a destination point implicit in it or explicit in it. So it works as subtly as this, for example. So if you walk into your room and you want to walk towards something to pick it up, and your room is cluttered because you've been careless, all that clutter manifests itself as an obstacle to your goal and produces negative emotion. And you experience that instantaneously, essentially, and automatically. And so part of the reason, that I encourage people to clean up their rooms, let's say, is, well, it's a microcosm of all this. Your room is part of your experience that you have control over. And it's easy to underestimate its significance. But that's a place you can alter. You can set it up for whatever it is that you're doing. Well, what are you doing? Well, that's the first question you have to ask yourself if you're going to set up your room. It's not trivial. It's hard.
I'm trying to get a hold of the Disney people at the moment because I want to do a lecture series on Pinocchio, because I think Pinocchio is brilliant work of art. And if you're a puppet and an actor, and Pinocchio is both at times in that movie, both a puppet and an actor. So why an actor? Like, why is there something wrong with being an actor? Well, the first question is, well, who sets your role? And then the second question is, who's pulling your strings? So you've put on this front that is there to make you popular and sexy and desirable and to mask from yourself your own inadequacies. But that's a role. Well, who wrote it? And for what purpose? And so Jung said, for example, look, we all acted out a myth, whether we knew it or not. And, maybe you're acting out a tragedy. Maybe you're acting out Narcissus. You don't know, because you've put that on yourself in an attempt in some ways to deliver to people what they want, or more accurately, to look as though you're delivering to people what they want. And it's not nothing to do that, right? Because at least you're attempting in some sense to adapt to the social world. Someone who's really infantile and dependent, someone who's never left home, part of their problem is that they haven't crafted a persona. So you don't want to denigrate it entirely, but it's no substitute for the real thing. And it turns out that not only is what we want from each other the real thing, but that's also the adventure of your life. And so if you aren't truthful, and that means, unfortunately, especially at the beginning, when you start to be truthful, it means deeply coming to terms with your inadequacies in humility. So it's very painful. Without that, you don't have the adventure of your life. You have the role that you've acquiesced to. And that'll take all the meaning out of your life. So when I was doing my clinical work, which I did a lot of career work with my clients, both at a beginner level, I would say, like really a beginner level, with people who had no employment whatsoever, no history of employment, who were undereducated and who lacked every skill you could possibly imagine. These are people who were really in dire straits, up to people who were operating at the top of their profession, but who could still strategize forward. And so, for example, let's say you're at a dead end in your job. Okay, so I don't find my work meaningful. All right, so that's a problem state. It's like, well, why not? I find the work I do repetitive and boring and without spirit. I have a bad relationship or a neutral relationship with my boss who doesn't know who I am. I have problems with coworkers. All of that needs to be differentiated, right, and analyzed in detail. So we might say, for example, let's say you believe that you're undervalued at work, and maybe you are. What you need to do is you have something to say, and we would have to figure out what it is that you have to say. But it would be some variant of, I'm bringing more value to the table than I'm being compensated for, and that's demoralizing me. And it's also not good for you, you being my boss, because if I'm actually more valuable than is being recognized, then the fact that you're not valuing me properly means that I will become demoralized. I won't work properly, and you won't get the best out of me. So it's bad for both of us. And if your boss is in principle not amenable to such a discussion, then what you should seriously consider doing is finding another job. Okay, so let's say we're going to set you up for this. Okay, this isn't like next week's enterprise, man. This is your life. So the first thing I would ask is, well, do you have your resume or CV in order? Well, I haven't typed it up for 3 years. Well, what do you think about bringing it up? Well, I'm pretty nervous about that because there's some holes in it. And, I didn't do so well in college and I'm kind of embarrassed about my resume. It's like, okay, bring it in. Let's go through it. Let's at least update it. Let's look where the holes are. Let's look at where the inadequacies are as far as you're concerned, right? This isn't my judgment. It's your judgment. Let's walk through those judgments and see if they're warranted, because maybe you're just too guilty and ashamed and self-conscious and anxious, and you're looking at your resume more critically than someone else would. And maybe there's some holes that you need to rectify. You were 2 courses away from your BA and you dropped out or something like that. Well, maybe we need 6 months to address that. And at least, even if you can't be fully educated, you could be taking some courses online. And so when you went to a new job interview and they said, what about this hole? You'd say, well, I came to terms with that 6 months ago, and in an effort to rectify it, I'm taking the following courses, and here's my plan for completion. That's a really good answer. And anyone with any sense who's interviewing will accept that as an indication that although you're not perfect, and who is, that you have a good plan and that you've thought it through. Like, that's the kind of answer that in all likelihood will cement your candidacy for the position. Okay, so now you're going to go to your boss. Well, you have to have your CV and your resume in order. And you have to be able to stand on it solidly, and which at least means that you're prepared to address the inadequacies in a credible, realistic, believable, and truthful manner. All right. Now what you do is apply for like 10 jobs. You don't have to take them, but maybe you have to go to an interview or 2 or 3 or 4. And maybe there's a bunch of opportunities out there for you that you didn't even know about. And maybe someone offers you a job. And so now you can go to your boss and say, here's the situation I'm in here at work. Here's my evaluation of the problems in relationship to me. Here's what I could do for you if you gave me a 40% raise and the opportunity to progress, but I'd like to see a plan for that. And I've been looking for other opportunities before conducting this discussion, and I have some. Well, then, if your boss treats you with contempt at that point and doesn't listen, then perhaps he or she is a little more narcissistic than might be optimal, and it's time to find a new job. But this isn't something you do trivially. And so when you're doubtful, say you're trapped, you ask yourself, well, why am I trapped? And that's a hard question, right? Because some of it's your own inadequacy. A lot of it, and all of the part of it that you can deal with, is your own inadequacy. So even if it's unfair, even if you're hemmed in for any number of reasons, inappropriate, like ethnically predicated oppression, let's say, or maybe you're in a workplace that really is sexist in some fundamental sense. Well, that's not good. It's not just. It's not fair. It's not meritorious. All of those things. Man, maybe you shouldn't be there. But what you can do to begin with is every bloody thing you possibly can do to put yourself in the most virtuous and powerful negotiating position possible. And you have to think like a snake in some sense to do that. You got to get the details right. You have to be prepared to bite, and you have to have your eyes on the prize, so to speak. If you want to know something about yourself, sit on your bed one night and say to yourself, you got to mean this. Like, you got to be desperate. This is no game, this. It's like, my life is not everything I want it to be, and perhaps it's not everything that I need it to be. And by need, I mean my life is so unbearable that the suffering that's attendant upon that is make me nihilistic, cynical, bitter, resentful, homicidal, genocidal, unable to have a good relationship, prone to punish people for their virtues because of my jealousy, driving the proclivity to see evil everywhere except within my own heart. Like, these are problems, man. And you ask yourself, you sit on the bed and say, okay, man, I'm ready to learn something. Like, what's one thing I'm doing wrong that I know I'm doing wrong that I could fix, that I would fix? It's like, you meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one. And it's often something that will point you to small things. So Carl Jung said, people in the modern world don't see God because they don't look low enough. And so imagine you're in your messy bedroom, and you're sitting on the edge of the bed trying to have an honest dialogue with yourself. And the little voice says, it's pretty disgusting in here. And you think, well, I'm way above such trivial niceties as organizing my room. It's like, well, that's pride. That's arrogance. If you're above organizing what's actually yours, how in the world are you ever going to organize anything else? And so you get on your knees and you think, well, it's time to, you know, take a brush to the toilet. And maybe that's where you start. And that works. Like that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things you know that are wrong. You'll improve unbelievably rapidly.
How do you advise people that are dealing with imposter syndrome?
Oh, everyone deals with that. Every time you make a status shift, as you move upwards, of course you have imposter syndrome, because when you first make a transition into a new role, you are an imposter because you're a beginner. You don't know what you're doing. And that doesn't mean you're a liar or a fake. And it doesn't mean you should presume more knowledge than you have. It's, what did Nietzsche say? Every great man is an actor of his own ideal. And that feeds into the imposter syndrome in some sense. If you want to move to the next stage, at some point you have to act like you're already there when you're just barely started. And that's not a lie. You know, it's the willingness. It can be, and it can degenerate into a lie, especially if you presume more than you know. But if you move, you know, let's say you move from being an undergraduate to a graduate student. Well, all the other graduate students and the professors know that you're just a beginning graduate student. They're not going to expect as much from you as they would from a more seasoned graduate student. So you have some leeway that's genuine, but you are, you know, the low-rung occupier of that role. And of course you're going to feel like you're an imposter if you have any sense, because you're just barely there. You just made the transition. That's okay. You know, that's not a problem. First of all, you have to understand that everyone with any sense who isn't narcissistic feels that. And it's actually an indication of your mental health and your competence, as long as that doesn't become crippling. It shouldn't knock you out. I'm such a phony. Well, don't be a phony. That's the first thing. If you're dealing with competent people and you admit your ignorance, the competent people never judge you harshly for that, as long as you've been paying attention. So in my classes, for example, people were often afraid to ask questions. And so sometimes I would point to people and ask them if they had a question, especially the quieter types. And they'd be afraid to ask the question because, well, they're revealing their ignorance. And they would assume they're the only person in the room that's that ignorant, but they're not, because if they were paying attention and they had a question, the probability that half the class had that question was really high. It's different if you're not paying attention. And so you can be ignorant, you can be an ignorant newbie, and you can even ask the questions that are necessary to ask in that position and sort of reveal your inadequacy. And as long as you're dealing with competent people and you've been paying attention, they're just going to answer your questions. And then you only have to be ignorant once. That's the thing about asking a stupid question. You only have to ask it once, then you're no longer stupid. It's very difficult to calibrate how many units of physiological preparedness you should manifest per unit of threat.
Mm-hmm.
Right? How big's the threat? The answer is, you don't know. You wake up in the morning and you have an ache in your side. Is that nothing? Or is that the cancer that's going to kill you in 6 months? And it's pretty low probability that it's the latter, but the probability is not zero. So why shouldn't you be panicked out of your mind? And the answer is, some people are. And sometimes they're right. So the calibration of threat, especially when it's associated with novelty, is an impossibly difficult computational problem. We have like 10 different mechanisms to try to solve that. And one of the mechanisms is, well, there's tremendous variability in response. And if you're higher in trait neuroticism, you're going to have the problem you're described all the time. You're going to be doubtful about your competence and the validity of your position. And the only treatment we really know for that is to expose yourself to things that you're afraid of voluntarily and to become braver as a consequence of doing that. But some people have to live with that more than other people.
The thing that I realized was that after a while, if you continue to disprove your imposter syndrome in the real world, you have a challenge, you're adamant that you probably won't or might not or don't deserve to get past it, and then you do, after a while, you have to admit to yourself that your imposter syndrome has nothing to do with your capacity and everything to do with your addiction about feeling like an imposter.
Yeah.
And
Well, and that does change as people age. Generally speaking, they become more agreeable, more conscientious, and lower in negative emotion. And some of that is that adaptation. You see that you survived through various challenges, and then you can review that evidence to yourself, but also the people around you bolster you because they have confidence in you, and so their anxiety doesn't trigger your anxiety, and they'll remind you too. You know, you got this. You've done things in the past.
such a wealth of data, you know? You've done it so many times.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think
And that does help. I mean, it does help. People get more confident as they get older and they accrue experience because of that. But it's subject to that underlying trait variability and sensitivity to negative emotion. And there's been good psychometric analysis of self-esteem scales and neuroticism scales. And they're pretty much the same thing reversed. And so, are you confident in yourself? Self-esteem. Do you lack confidence? Trait neuroticism. And so it is harder for some people because it takes more evidence for them to dampen down their response to threat. So, and it's partly because we're all adapted to some degree to the failure of induction, right? Just because something happened multiple times in the past does not mean necessarily that it will happen the next time. And that's it's the farmer and chicken problem, right? Farmer's always feeding the chicken. Chicken thinks the farmer's his best friend, but one day the chicken is dinner. And that's induction. There was a stable pattern in the past. You come to rely on it, but at any time that axiom can be disproved. And so the fact that we have variability in trait neuroticism is a consequence of the probability of the failure of induction. It's a very difficult problem to solve, how to regulate negative emotion. But I would say that the best way we know is to keep facing challenges voluntarily, pay attention at a rate that works for you, develop your competence. That actually stabilizes the environment around you, so it actually is less predictable and less threatening. Plus you accrue that evidence, and you get the social support for doing so. That's your best pathway forward.
So there's this idea that Carl Jung developed. He extracted it, I don't know from where, from some ancient writings that he was familiar with. I believe they were Jewish writings. He said that, classically speaking, traditionally speaking, God was viewed to rule being with two hands, the right hand and the left hand. And the right hand was justice. And that was, you're going to get what's coming to you. But the left hand was mercy. And the idea essentially was that the cosmos could not exist without the proper combination of justice and mercy. You should get what's coming to you. But people are fallible and they make mistakes. And so it's reasonable to apply that to yourself. You know, there's an idea that's been developed by psychologists over the last few decades that people are basically narcissistic and that they generally feel that they're better at most things than other people. I don't buy that. I don't think the experimental evidence for that is very strong, and I certainly haven't seen that, for example, in my clinical practice, where I've seen that people are generally far harder on themselves than they are on other people. One example of that, I've written about this in my new book too, is that, you know, if you have a pet that's sick and you take it to the vet and you get medication, you're very likely to give the pet the entire course of medication, to go to the pharmacy to get the prescription filled, to give the pet the medication, to follow it through. But if you are the person who has the problem, yeah, you all laugh because you know the story. It's like a third of you won't even go fill the prescription, and of the remaining 2/3 of you, half won't take it to completion. And you think, well, why are people like that? And I think it's because they know themselves, they have contempt for themselves because of their flaws,